Hello everyone, welcome back to the FSR Policy Briefcase. Still with me, Leonardo Meeus.
And me, Jean-Michel.
And this time we're also very happy to welcome Lena Kitzing. So Lena is a part-time professor in our school, and she's also a professor at DTU in Copenhagen. Lena joined our school about a year ago. If I remember well, we met at a conference, and it was perfect timing because contract for difference, the topic of this episode, was really at the center of the debate during the energy crisis. But we at Florence School of Regulation, we did not really have an expert. So when we met, you kindly shared your work, and I was really impressed reading your papers because it turned out that you were not just working on the topic because it was trendy, you had really already built a career working on this topic. Of course, you do more than that, but today we are having you here as an expert on contract for difference, or CfD, so I hope you will forgive us to always use this acronym, CfD. Welcome, Lena.
Thank you very much for having me.
So today's episode is a natural transition from our previous two on long-term contracts with Leigh Hancher and Jean-Michel. The importance of these long-term contracts in the energy transition and the importance of having private contracts because, of course, we cannot do everything with public contracts. Still, at least some of the long-term contracting will be contracts signed by government or entities mandated by government, and these contracts are likely to be the so-called contracts for difference, or CfDs. Lena was the lead author on a recent FSR technical report dissecting the different designs of contracts for difference, or CfDs. Most of your excellent report is on the implementation of CfDs, the different design options, their pros and cons. We will get to that topic of design and implementation in the second half of this podcast. But in the first half, we would like to discuss just a bit on the history of renewable support schemes and why CfDs emerged victorious versus the other options. So first I'll hand over to Leigh to do a bit on the history.
Yeah, thanks, James. So I was thinking myself, what is this history? And probably I'm going to give you a very oversimplified version, but you're here to correct me or compliment me. So the way I remember it is that we said, okay, we want to support renewable energy. We have carbon pricing, but maybe the signal of carbon pricing is not strong enough. So what can we do extra? And then we said, maybe we just hand out certificates to renewable producers for whatever they produce, they get a certificate, and then we can oblige suppliers, for instance, to buy these certificates. And then, just like carbon pricing, we again have a market mechanism where the supply and the demand for these certificates determines the price. Some people discussed, can we not do that at European level? So again, we create a bigger pool, a bigger market, and also more stable prices, but that didn't work out. Some countries tried to do it at national level, but at national level, these prices were quite volatile, which then led to many people concluding, I understood, to say maybe it's better to go to feed-in tariffs. What are these feed-in tariffs? It was more to have a fixed price for whatever renewable energy you feed into the system. That then works as a subsidy, right? A fixed subsidy, but then we said, no, but we also want renewables to be part of the market. So instead of just giving a fixed price feed-in tariff, we said, why don't we do a premium, a subsidy on top of the energy market price. So you're still exposed to the market price and you get something extra. I thought that was more or less where we arrived. Then we also started to say, we need more auction-based pricing of this renewable subsidy. So you don't have an administration that has to guess the price, but you have a bidding process. And then all of a sudden we go to the last energy crisis and we have exceptionally high market prices. And I think we were taken by surprise because we thought renewables needed support, and all of a sudden they were not only cheaper than gas power plants who were setting the price, all of a sudden they were being blamed to have windfall profits. And then everybody's starting to say, yeah, but that windfall profits is not necessarily a problem in every country. Some countries have these famous contract for difference, CfDs, like France was quoted to result in billions of money being given back to taxpayers. So somehow, some countries had already anticipated the possibility of windfall profits and had embedded in their renewable support scheme design a clawback mechanism. So great. But then I discovered from your work that there were several countries that had already introduced these CfDs before the crisis. And what I do not know is whether these are all the countries that were anticipating this kind of problem we had, or did they have other reasons to implement the CfD. So basically, what other qualities do CfDs have that I'm not yet fully aware of, and why might they be better than these feed-in tariffs or feed-in premiums, Lena?
Well, thank you very much for this very quick walk through the history of support schemes. I think it's very interesting. I think one thing that you come into is this very, very fundamental question of should we give a quantity-based support or should we give price-based support? And I think that has always been the big question in renewable support. And as you say rightly, there have been some attempts of having purely quantity-based support schemes with certificates. They have never been the dominant scheme in Europe. Most of the schemes actually have always been feed-in tariffs, and they have already started in actually long before the carbon pricing existed in the 90s, early schemes already in the late 80s, where both Germany and Denmark started to support renewables but based on some kind of schemes that are similar to feed-in tariffs. What these early schemes had all in common is that they didn't allow renewables to participate in the markets. Also, of course, in the very early days, we didn't have markets yet, but they would take off the power from the renewables, and then they would live their own life in parallel to the whole market system that was being built up in Europe. And the initiative was a lot of the schemes then were, how can we integrate the renewables better into the markets by making them selling their power onto the spot electricity markets. And most of the different developments in renewable support actually was targeted towards that. For example, the fixed premiums that you have said, but then also variable market premiums that have come in. And also the certificate schemes, they all mandated the renewables to be selling on the market. And that was a really good development. At the time, we had really high support needs. So the required fixed prices of the renewables was much, much higher than the market price, sometimes 5 times higher or so. So in there, we didn't really differentiate so much between if in case the market price was higher than the strike price or the agreed fixed price, what should happen there. Actually, the very early schemes, they didn't even regulate that. And then some countries, they went into this direction where they said, well, what do you need as a renewable producer? You need price stability. Price stability means that I can guarantee you, like what we always did in the feed-in tariff, we guarantee you a fixed price. And that means you would always get this price. And then all of a sudden, you know, the clawback mechanism was kind of built in because we said, okay, we guarantee that fixed price. Other countries, like for example, Germany and the Netherlands, they have opted for a sliding variant where the market upside, so the part that was above the fixed price that was agreed, could be kept by the producer. And that was for certain reasons, to initiate certain, market activity, market creativity. So that was I think to be honest, the choice to let the market upside be with the producers that was the conscious choice to be made rather than the one to take it away from them. Then this move from, these kind of variable premiums and then into calling it contracts for difference. This happened first, we've seen the term in the UK, in a white paper in the UK. That was already in 2011 when it was discussed. But the schemes itself was already in place. In Denmark, we had this variable price scheme that was actually a two-sided contract for difference in place since 2005 for offshore wind. So that's been a long time. And we always treat it as one of the ways you can make renewable support so that renewables are active on the market while still have stable prices, so fixed prices towards the government. So it's been around for a long time, but when you look into it, there are not so many countries in Europe who have actually implemented contracts for difference. So when we count these two-sided contracts for difference. So there is both a payout and a clawback above or below the strike price. That's actually only 9 European member states who have implemented CfDs at the moment.
So in this history, you're speaking about the evolution, so the need for contracts for difference, the problem they've solved, the addition of the second side, essentially, so the clawback side, and how we arrived at that point. You mentioned several countries, mostly in Europe. Oh, to my sadness, you included the UK in the list of examples of early adopters, which brings me on to my first question. Do you see the application of these tools outside of Europe already, or are they finding different ways of resolving the same kind of problems?
So what you need for CfDs, we can talk a little bit more about what they actually are, but because you're making a contract on the price of a product, you're not making a contract on the product itself, right? That's why they call contracts for difference. So you're stabilizing a price. Yeah. What it needs is you need to have a very liquid and very well-functioning market that creates those prices, right? So there are not so many countries outside of Europe where you have these very liquid, very well-functioning market pools. Yeah. We've seen several instruments that are somewhat like CfDs in the US, in some jurisdictions in the US, but across the globe it's not super well spread, not very much so yet, because the nature of the product, the nature of the contract does need a very, very well functioning commodity.
So in that sense, bringing it back to Europe, now we know that that's the context where it sort of makes most sense to our local needs. CfDs have also been suggested for other technologies, right? Besides renewable energy. They might be used for nuclear assets, for example, also for storage. This episode of the podcast is not so much about commenting technology choices some countries might like to make, but it would be nice to hear from you whether we can use the same type of contracts for these technologies, or whether there is something about renewables that makes them a better match with CfDs than other technologies.
Yeah, so CfDs make a lot of sense for those assets that need price stabilization. And price stabilization is required, very, very much simplified, especially for those assets who have high bankability needs or high financing needs, right? So those with the very, very high investment costs, they need price stabilization because they have typically very fixed cost. Yeah. So they need to match their cost structure better with their price structure. And you can see that also if CfDs are not available or in other areas, you would then have fixed price PPAs, for example, instead, so to match this, right? So that naturally emerges. And that's the same case for nuclear, for example. They have very high investment asset costs as well. On the other hand, if you have assets that are low investment cost and that they can operate really flexible on the market, you would not like to have fixed price contracts, right? Because you would like them to be really agile and exactly. Yeah. So that's also why I'm a little bit skeptic on storage, for example, right? So because they also need to act very flexible, how you would structure these contracts. We know that you can structure CfDs in a way that they create short-term flexibility incentives and variability incentives. But in general, as a rule of thumb, it's the inflexible or non-controllable or less controllable high investment assets.
Yeah, and I guess it's not only the advantage of the producers, but in the end also the consumers, right? Because if we get access to cheaper financed renewables, it's good for everyone. As we announced, we would have the first part on the history, and that was really interesting for me. And the second part is on implementation, which brings us also closer to the report, right? Because in your report, you really go far in discussing good design principles for contract for difference. You also discuss the fact that maybe sometimes we need to tailor these contracts to specific contexts of a country. One example you always give, I understood, is if you already have an abundance of renewable, I'm listening and I'm learning from you, Lena. So if we have an abundance of renewable energy, maybe you need a more sophisticated type of contract that is nudging a bit more the behavior, while for other countries that are just starting with renewables, maybe, and also don't yet have experience with these contracts, maybe they want to go for something simpler. So that's something I understood. But I thought really to have the opportunity to have you here to come back to this discussion we had during the crisis, because not only during the crisis, more and more people agreed that CfDs could play a bigger role, as they did in the past. But people also said, if they play a bigger role, and if we go to more renewables, maybe the design needs to be different, right? That was a big discussion, and people started to say the main problem maybe of the current design going forward, according to several experts, was that you are still being paid to produce, right? That's still the case. And then maybe we do not always want you to produce. Sometimes we can have oversupply, and that will increase in the future, right? Moments of oversupply. We already see it with more and more moments in the year that in electricity you have even negative prices. So then some experts, when referring to that problem, also said the solution to that problem is what you refer to in your report as contracts for difference, independent of generation. And then I understood also that many different proposals have been made, but independent of generation basically means you can not produce and still get subsidies, which is a bit weird, but you would then sort of have to follow a benchmark, a yardstick, or whatever. That is behavior we want you to follow, and to the extent that you follow that behavior, you are subsidized. But then, very interesting about your report, is that you're not yet fully convinced. Can you explain why you're not yet fully convinced of this new type of CfDs, and also why you think we could treat maybe the same problem also in another way?
Yeah, I will start out by saying that I find the ideas around these generation-independent CfDs really compelling. They are solving conceptually a problem that we have always been sitting with renewable support, and we can discuss that problem a little bit. But we are not. We haven't seen any practical implementation that can solve in real life all these problems yet. But I think so the problem around that is that if you are linking your renewable support payment to the output of the plant, you will affect choices. You affect production choices. And as an economist, you would always try to avoid that because it distorts the market, right? You would like to design your scheme in a way that you don't distort any decisions, any production decisions, any bidding decisions that you're making on the market. So that's the ideal situation. And that's also why in the very, very beginning, actually before we even talked about the price versus quantity and so on in renewable support, we have had investment grant type of support schemes that were just paying out. If you invested in a certain amount of capacity, you would just get an investment grant. So it still works. We also have investment tax credits and other things in the US. So it's still there as a secondary support mechanism. But what turned out in real life is that if you didn't align your payment with what you actually need from the producers, there is this misalignment of incentives, which can lead to strategic behavior. It can also just lead to practical issues and so on. And we acknowledge it's a second best option from an economic perspective to link the support payment to the actual generation. But from a policy perspective, that's actually exactly what you want, right? You want valuable electrons in the grid. And if you link your payment to it, that's exactly what you're going to get, right? So there is this dilemma in some way, right, between the first best economic concept, or it's not even first best, right? Because we are still talking dedicated renewable support, right? First best would be, carbon tax, but from there and then to go and meddle with the actual decisions on the market, that's a problem. So what we've been trying to do in these support schemes, we have a lot of times then said, okay, well, we acknowledge from policymakers' perspective, there is this need for linking the renewable payments to the actual generation because that's what we need from them. When we do that, how can we minimize the distortions on the market? And there have been quite a lot of developments around these minimizations, and we can now see that a lot of support schemes CfDs, but also others, they can actually be designed in a way that they do not distort the price formation and the bidding behavior of renewables on the day-ahead market. That's possible. So a lot of the criticism from these promoters of generation-independent CfDs, it's, in my view, partially unfounded, because the way that CfDs can be designed and also are designed in many European countries, they're actually not providing these produce and forget incentives at all. They are non-distortive on the day-ahead market. What we have not solved yet is how they behave on the intraday market, because there, again, here, there's your commitments from the day-ahead market. Even if that has happened in the right way, you're still making your decisions on the intraday market based on opportunity cost, because your actual production decision is linked to your commitments, and it's linked to what you're going to get from the state. And there, actually, we have had some interesting discussions on how that can be unlinked. And one solution could be to disentangle the payout from the actual production. It could be the expected production, or it could be a mathematically modeled production, or it could be also even a production potential based not on the specific plant, but on a more general level. How that exactly is going to be done in a way that both adheres to data law, that adheres to incentives around data sharing, and also brings into alignment what we need from the producers and what we are paying for them. This is a little bit more tricky.
Okay, so if I conclude with my own words, there are market distortions potentially. One way of fixing them is to move away from generation dependent, but there are also many other ways of doing it. Like, I think in the report you also mentioned simply no payout when prices are negative, or a payout based on some reference price that is an average or something instead of hour per hour. And these solutions should not be forgotten. But now at the end, I hear you say that maybe it can also be a combination of making, working on the pricing, but maybe also for intraday to work a bit on what is the generation that we use as a reference for this contract. So is that correct?
Yeah, so the generation-dependent CfD designs, they can fix wrong behavior on the day-ahead market. They cannot fix intraday or balancing markets at the moment, because it's still... And one way of fixing it could be this generation-independent payout. It could be also revisiting of how we are, paying out or price formation on the intraday market. There is different ways of how this could be done, or also how we are indexing in the generation-dependent.
And that brings us again to this context specificity, right? To the extent that the intraday is really a big issue, is then maybe where you want to address that.
Yeah, exactly. Because also, it will depend a lot on the different market characteristics where you are, right? So do you even have a very well-formed, very liquid intraday market, balancing market? What is your product on those markets? What does it look like for you? Do you have a lot of... So the problem with the price distortions in the generation-dependent schemes happens when there is a huge price discrepancy, a divergence between the day-ahead and the intraday market, because there you want to change your commitment, right? Only if that happens. And if you're under certain payout or clawback mechanism, right, then you create these distortions, right? If that never happens in your market, it's maybe not a problem, right? Or if it only happens in one way, or if you're with renewables, also such a small niche that they might not be able to even, change anything in the market. And I think that's also one of the things that we need to remember, is that these renewable support schemes, they have always been designed for niches, right? 5% of the market, 10% of the market, they were never able to actually move a lot. But now we're looking into the future where we might end up in a situation that 50% of the market is going to be under that one support scheme design. And that, of course, will change a lot. So with this full rollout, and then also in several countries, in most countries of Europe at the same time, where they're all maybe starting to affect the market, that will be in effect, it still needs to be investigated. It's a completely different scale of what we used to be thinking about in support scheme design.
And if I may, this is a really fascinating discussion about the intricacies of adapting CFD for all of these kind of different conditions, and being very agile with the configuration of the scheme itself. But I would be curious also to get your opinions on how CFDs, this public support mechanism, sit relative to PPAs, power purchase agreements, something we discussed at length in the last 2 podcasts as well on long-term contracts, because I believe it's often said that CFDs can come instead of PPAs, right? There's potentially like a trade-off there. And this implicitly seems unfortunate because, of course, we want to promote PPAs, right? This is a commercial agreement and as such doesn't necessarily burden the taxpayer directly. Your report includes several examples, right, of countries trying to combine PPA and CFDs. Can you give us perhaps a few examples that you think are promising to consider and perhaps if they would work in other countries?
Yeah, so first of all, I would like to emphasize that as long as you can create renewable investments based on market terms alone, through PPAs, for example, we should always try to prioritize that.
Yeah.
So as much as you can, go for these PPAs and maybe even investment on forward market basis, or So and that's also what the electricity market reform actually says, is that if that's not enough, if that's not happening, and the renewables need support from government, then we go to CfDs, right? And that's important because there is interactions, as you say, and we need to understand how the CfD scheme, how it might affect PPA market, and we need to avoid that, right? So what we see at the moment is that they affect each other because they're basically they have the same function, right? So they are stabilizing prices and they ensure bankability so that they can be financed, the investments can be financed, and they secure a certain revenue, right? So the idea is that we are keeping whatever we can from the PPAs and encourage them as much as possible, and then we are kind of creating a safety net underneath for those who cannot be in those PPAs with the CfDs. So that is the idea, and there have been some early implementations before. I have to admit it was a little bit Wild West, yes, with the support schemes, right? So we have some countries who just said, no, you cannot do that. You cannot have PPAs in parallel with CfDs. And then there's other countries that just didn't regulate. So we have seen PPAs being concluded on top of CfDs, and so it's actually happening. So I'm happy that there is a lot of thought being brought into that now. So how can we make the markets work in parallel in a good way? So you've probably alluded to this the scheme in Belgium that's started up now, where you can actually conclude a CfD, and then based on this safety net of the CfD, you can actually go out into the market and try to find a PPA, and there is of course conditions around that, right? Because you cannot just conclude anything. It needs to be within a certain range of the strike price, because otherwise you could start to play the system. And so I think that's a really interesting development. How it can then play out in the real world. We will see, if it's possible to find these contractors and if there are implementations. But I think it's a really, really very good step forward. Yeah. So you can do that. Always with this idea of safety net. And then another idea could be also, that's been discussed, which I find really interesting, is that you might only contract maybe 80% of the volumes of a certain installation for the CfD, because that's also in reality something that maybe is fine for the banks, because they have some safety buffers anyways and so on. So you can actually say, okay, well, we make the CfD so for a certain volume that it's still bankable, but then there is another 20% of your production, for example, 10%, 20%, that then either you just go merchant with, or you can conclude PPAs with. And I think that is interesting because it does give a big signal to the market, and also the market will see, based on the renewable rollout plans, what the potential market could be, right? So I think there's good ideas around that. And then also, of course, we can think about other CfD designs if maybe a shorter lifetime of the contract or like a later start of the contract would help into PPAs. Yeah. Yes, but overall, we also know that the PPA market in Europe is not that huge. Yeah. Right? So we don't have that many consumers who are investment grade, who can give these bankable PPAs. So what government could also do is to help those companies to become investment grade. So with some financial engineering, securitization of these market contracts, you could also help the PPA market on the way. So that would be outside of CfD design.
A well-designed CfD can de-risk the investment, which is the objective for capex-intensive industries, without desensitizing to the potential opportunities and upsides that exist from being a bit more dynamic on the market. At least that's how I understand it.
Very well put.
Okay. I've been spending too much time reading your report, listening to the FSR Insights episode, and now trying to follow the conversation between Leo and Lena. I'm glad it's working on some level. I was also, as you were speaking, I was thinking, I work in the hydrogen space predominantly, and I was wondering when you were saying there's not so much demand for PPAs, it doesn't constitute a large part of the market. A big part of the discourse on making bankability in hydrogen projects and ensuring that the electricity that goes into producing the hydrogen is of renewable origin is all built around the concept of PPAs. And I wonder, depending on how much that materializes as a market, how much of an impact it could have on the CfD space, the PPA space, and how big of an influence in general. Perhaps not, we don't have time to discuss it today, but it's an interesting...
No, I think it's very important. And also because they influence each other, we should really be aware, this whole RNFBO discussion also, it should really be aligned with what we do in one part of the market so that it actually fits to the other part. Yes, and I completely agree.
And of course, the hydrogen production can also have an impact on these zero and negative prices, which are also, part of the contractual discussions for the CfDs. So, yeah, definitely something to explore. Sorry, Leigh, I go back to you.
I think we might still have time for one quick question. You already said contracts for difference is about stabilizing prices. So you pay out the difference between a market price and the price the producer needs. And then indeed you need liquid markets. And then normally this reference is the day ahead market. You already said maybe the reference should also be partly intraday because both markets are important for renewables. But then we also have forward markets. And another concern of the last reform was that we didn't have enough liquid forward markets, right? Because PPAs is really long term, 10, 15 years even. But then forward, 1 year, 2 year, 3 year. Could we sort of embed that also in the design of CfDs so that you nudge renewable producers to also sign forward contracts? Or what do you think of that? That was an idea that was suggested at a conference at Paris Dauphine, so I'm asking the question, what do you think about it?
So forward markets are, again, rather similar in some way to CfDs because they are products on financial products on a future production possibility. So, and these products, the forward market is actually quite diverse, right? So we have a lot of short-term products, a week ahead, month ahead, quarter ahead, year ahead, and then we have some rather long-term projects, 5 years, and since recently also 10 years. But none of these products ensure bankability for renewables, right? So they are not, you cannot use them for the function that the CfDs have. But what you can do is you can try to avoid that the CfDs mess up the forward market too much or dry it up. And we've done a small analysis around that, and we do think that some certain CfD designs would allow forward trading, especially if these averaging periods are quite long. you would still have an incentive to maybe within that period do some of the trades that you usually do. You would have your normal trading incentives within those periods, and most of the trading actually happens also within a year, right, of these contracts. So that we do see some compatibility of these contracts. So regarding the reference price that you asked about, I think if you would like to create an index, so what would be the least risk for the investors would be if the price reflects the best how their actual income is on the market, because then risk would be reduced. I'm not saying that's exactly what all the investors want, right? But maybe they also want to play the market a little bit and get the ability to earn more, but risk would be reduced if it reflects the best. So if you go into your specific market and you look what their actually income distribution is across these different markets, and you can create an index around that, I would be all for it. I think it might be a little bit difficult with the forward market because usually they are rolled into the physical delivery. So there's you probably know much more about that than I do, but so I wonder if that would be relevant.
Really good. So I think the two conclusions are, one, if anyone wants to go down the route of designing CfDs, know that you will have more than one version. You will have to adapt along the way. And second is, we still also need to do some research, right? Because I really also like that aspect of your report, that you at several moments say, this is what we know, and this is where we're still looking. Like, for instance, this generation independent, as you said, there is still it's a nice idea, but there are still quite some questions around it. So I hope we can continue to work on the topic, that you will continue to work on the topic, and we can invite you maybe again also. James, what do you think?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's thank you so much for giving your time today. Particularly, I don't think the audience would have even picked it up, but Lena is struggling tremendously with her voice these last couple of days because really everyone wants to hear what she has to say about this subject. So thank you for being so generous with your time. And yeah, really, the biggest compliment I can give to the report itself is that it's clear and intuitive enough for a complete non-expert like myself to be able to keep up and follow a conversation between you two experts. So yeah, I really encourage our listeners to go take a look at it. And yeah, thanks again. Hopefully we can do this, as Leo says, when these next lines of research have been elaborated, we can do a sort of part 2.
That'd be lovely. Yes, and maybe also I think one of the reasons we do all of this here is that we would like to maybe interest the younger researchers into going into the topic, and I can only encourage that because there is a lot of things that we still need to find out. So there's a lot of opportunity.
There you go. Thank you.
Thank you so much.